live. Apologies, there'll be lots of uncertainty as I've never live streamed on Twitch before. So at the moment, what I'm doing is just checking whether this is working. I think there's generally a little bit of a delay. Oh, people can hear me. Can you see my screen? I'm now asking. Oh, huge delay. Okay, people can hear me. 6-second delay. Okay. How do you know it's 6 seconds? How do you know when I spoke? How do you know you heard it 6 seconds after I said it? Oh, okay. Generally, there is a 6-second delay. I don't think that matters because, apart from the fact that if you try and get my attention in response to something that I've done, I won't see it for 6 seconds. Okay. So anybody who just randomly happens up across this, what's happening is I am with some colleagues and we are in the middle of a oh, hang on, I'm just checking. People have told me they can hear me, but they haven't told me whether they can see my screen, which should be a diagram saying reconciliation intro. So I'm just checking. Yes, people can see my screen. Fantastic. So I'm with some colleagues and we are in the midst of a refactoring workshop. Earlier on, I gave them the slightly mean exercise of trying to refactor some code from the Gilded Rose kata, which I got the code from Emily Bacher, but I didn't give them any tests at all. So that was quite interesting to see how they reacted to that. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to walk through an example of some refactoring, and it's quite the example that I'm going to use is an example from an article on Martin Fowler's website that I wrote about refactoring. The funny thing is, it only just occurred to me today that I could use that example. I was actually thinking, oh, what refactoring example can I find that's in C# and not Ruby, which is what I've been doing recently. I had loads of Ruby refactoring examples, and then I thought, oh, well, how about the one that I wrote an article about? So that was a last minute decision. And I'm going to attempt to just walk through a little bit of refactoring and talk about some of the principles that I'm using. So the diagram that you see on screen at the moment is representing a class called Reconciliation Intro, which is in a code base that I wrote, and it was at the point at which this article was written and this piece of refactoring started, it was not in a good state. It was not good code. It is not code that I would be proud of. It was code that was written late at night and at weekends when I was half asleep in a hurry, and it wasn't brilliant. So I'm not going to worry too much about trying to explain what the code does. It's actually a piece of accounting software that I use to do my own accounting. But the important thing is that this class, this reconciliation intro class, was too big. It had tons and tons of functionality in it, and what I wanted to do was start separating it out into new classes. And the very first thing that I did was I just looked at the code and thought about how can I divide it up into different areas. So the very first thing that I did was I just created regions, which are a thing that you can do in C#, and I rearranged the code in this class into 5 regions, which are the ones you see on the screen now. And a first important principle, when I did that, I did it in one separate commit. So really important principle here is that if you're moving code but not changing it, commit it in a separate commit. Because what you'll see when you look at the diff from your commit is you'll see bits that are red and bits that are green, and that's just because that code has been moved from one place and to another. So it's red where it got taken out and green where it got put in. But if you've also changed the code in the meantime, you can't tell when you look at that commit what changed. You can just see that there is new code. So the very first thing I did was rearrange the code in a separate commit. And then I did a few other bits and bobs, but the point at which, so the next thing that I did was I had a look at all of these functions and I had a look at how they were dependent on each other and how they were connected to each other. I decided that I wanted to remove a bunch of code that was to do with file loading. And I realized that some of the file loading code was calling some of the other code that I wanted to keep separate. So I drew myself a little diagram to just try and visualize how all of the different functions were connected, and then I could think about what I wanted to do next. Actually, the next thing that I did was rearrange the code so that these functions that were being called by the blue code could live independently. In one case, I did that by making a function public so that it could be accessed by the blue code once it had been moved. In another case, this set path function, what I did was move the calling point of that code so that it was in the black section and it was all in the same class. And then I thought about what new classes do I want, and I drew a little diagram to think about what my new classes would be. If this had just been an exercise that I wasn't writing for an article, I wouldn't have put as much effort into that diagram. It would have just been a bit of scrappy stuff on a piece of paper. This has been tidied up for the sake of an article. And the point at which I'm going to join it is where I have already created some new tests. Well, what I've done is all of this functionality was already covered by tests, and this is another really important point. If I'm going to refactor my code, I want to know that I haven't broken anything. How do I know that I haven't broken anything? Because I've got tests that cover that code. Those tests should fail if I break anything. So there are already tests covering this code. The tests were originally pointing at this class, reconciliation intro. What I've done is I've created copies of the tests that cover the blue code and put them into a new test class so that those tests are currently duplicated. Both sets of tests are testing the same code, but the copies are in a new class. And that's another principle you'll see me use quite a lot. I will have duplicates of things temporarily. And the reason I do that is because I never want my code to not compile. So I'm going to try and keep the code compiling and keep the tests passing at all times. Another principle is that I'm going to be making really small commits. So where we join this exercise is that this is what I'm planning. It hasn't happened yet. I want to have a new class called a file loader class with all of this blue functionality on the right in the new class. So I'm now going to switch screens, which I practiced earlier. It's not too difficult. I'm going to move over to my Visual Studio, which is the IDE that I use for writing C#. I'm in Windows. If you're not in Windows, Visual Studio won't work, but if you're on a Mac, you can use Rider, which is a really good piece of software and is very similar. Or you can use Visual Studio Code. But yeah, so here I am. This is my horrible, horrible class, reconciliation intro. It's horrible code, by the way. I'm not proud of it. And one of the things that I'm going to keep noticing as I go through is I'm going to keep seeing things that I also hate and that I also want to refactor, and I'm going to try and be really disciplined and ignore it, because if I try and change too many things at once, then I'm going to lose track of what I'm doing. I'm not going to be able to keep my test passing, so I'm going to be really focused and just do one thing at a time. So the very first thing that I'm going to do on my diagram, I'm not going to try and switch back to the diagram. Unfortunately, that's a bit awkward in Twitch. The very first thing that I'm going to do is take away the one function in this section that is private, which is down here at the bottom. I've got this function called horrible function names as well. There's loads and loads of stuff in here that's horrible. Don't worry about it. But I'm going to take this function here, bank and bank out, add most recent credit card direct debit, which is a private function, and I'm going to move it out into a new class. And to keep things really simple, initially, I'm going to put that class in the same file. So here's my new class. So finally, I get to create my new file loader class, which is where I've been moving towards for the last few commits. There's a lovely quote from Kent Beck, which is, make the change easy and then make the easy change. So I've already done some prep work before this to make it possible for me to create this file loader class. So for instance, I created copies of the tests. So here's my new class, and I'm going to take this method that is my current target, and I'm going to copy it. So I'm not removing it yet. I'm just making a copy of it. I'm putting it in my new class, and I'm going to make it public. Again, this is temporary, but this will keep everything working. So this is now going to be a public method in the new class. Now, I've got a lovely little tool called nCrunch, which is constantly running all of my tests for me. You'll see, blimey, are there really that many of them? Okay, it seems to be running 1,100 tests. I can't quite believe that, but anyway. You see, it's probably hard to see, but there's a little dot moving around in a circle, which means that because I've made a change to the code, it's now rerunning the tests that it thinks are relevant. I'm a bit surprised about how many of them there are, but anyway, it's green, which is the important thing. And I at the moment, nothing is calling this new code. Nothing is referencing this new class. So I'm pretty confident that I haven't broken anything. So the very next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move this out into a separate file. Again, I'm using Resharper, which does a lot of things for me, which is really nice. So it will just move it to a new file loader.cs. It's also checking for any references. It's very clever and nice like that. So here we are. This is my new file, but it has automatically put it in the same folder as the original code. I don't really want it in there, so I'm going to move it into my loaders folder, which is where there's already some file loading code. And I'm going to fix the namespace because it's now in a different folder, and I've keeping my namespaces matching my folder structure because that keeps everything neat and easy to follow. And that's also a suggestion that Resharper will make for me. So there we go. I've got a new class. It's got a new method in it, but nothing is using it. So, and now I'm going to commit. So I'm actually going to make really frequent commits because even though I'm running my tests constantly, so I'm checking every time I do a commit, I'm waiting for these tests to pass. Although I do think there is something a bit odd going on at the moment. Why is it running so many tests and taking so long? Not quite sure, to be honest. But I do. There you go. My green line's getting there. Ideally, I want to know that all of these tests are passing at the point that I commit. But I'm also going to make really small commits so that if I do break anything, it's really easy to rewind and it's really easy to find the thing that broke something. So I'm just going to quickly commit that. You can't see that screen. I'm doing it on a separate screen, but I'm just going to commit that change. Extracted method to new file loader class. Oh, there you go. They've passed. Hurrah. There. So I've got a big N here, which I don't actually know what N stands for. I always think of it as neutral, but I guess it actually stands for nCrunch. But it's green and it's N, and that's good. So that might feel like I haven't really done anything much. I haven't. That's the point. I'm doing it in really small stages. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find places that are calling that code in my reconciliation intro class. And there's the definition, and here are the calls. So there are only two calls. They're both happening inside the same method. And in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an instance of my new file loader class. So that, with the correct capitalization, there we go. And now, instead of calling the private version that's in this class, I'm going to call the version that I just put in my new file loader class. Now, this is important. This really matters. At this point, I really want to know that my tests are passing. Because I might have missed some bit of connecting code. Things might not be hooked up correctly. It's probably a bit hard to see, but these green dots on the left reference the fact that all of these lines of code are covered by tests, and those tests were passing the last time they were run. That these green dots are slightly fuzzy, which means that it hasn't yet run all the tests that cover this bit. Oh, I see what's happening. Yeah, okay. I haven't got optimization turned on nCrunch. And that's why it's running every single test every single time. But those green dots have just gone solid, which means that I now know that all of the tests that covered this code are now passing. So I can be confident to save this file and commit this change. Again, really small commits. Later on, I might want to squash them into larger commits, but at the moment, I'm keeping very close track of what I'm doing. So I'm going to do a commit that says use new file loader class. And actually, before I do that commit, I may as well get rid of those private methods because they're not being used anywhere now. I want to be confident that they're not being used anywhere. I've got a bit of a clue in the fact that there are now black dots here, which is saying that this code isn't covered by any tests. But then maybe that's just because I've got rubbish test coverage, although that does mean that I won't necessarily know if I've broken anything. But I am actually quite confident with my test coverage. So now I've removed the old private method. The only version of that method now lives in the new file loader class. It's being called by the old code and everything is passing. So that's it. I've now moved one method into my new class. It would have been tempting because I have in this class, when I created my regions, I did identify a whole region, several methods that were all to do with file loading. It would have been tempting to just copy all of those methods over at the same time, but I already know from my diagrams that there are some dependencies, there are some complexities, and I'm doing things a little bit at a time so that at every point I'm confident in what I'm doing and I can easily roll back if there are any problems. So the next thing that I want to do is find another method. I think I'm just checking my notes to remind myself because thinking and talking at the same time is sometimes a bit challenging. But yes, the next thing that I want to do is move some more methods. Oh, no, the next thing that I want to do is change my tests. So the tests, I created a copy of the test. So in this file loader test file as well, it's a bit horrible. Don't worry, I know, but I'm only refactoring one thing at a time. In my file loader test file, originally I was using the old version of that method. So that's interesting. Why are they passing? Because I haven't moved the public method yet. That's the next thing that I want to do. So what I did was I took this function, which was originally private. I moved it into a new class, made it public in that new class, and then called it from here. Now that I've done that, I can move this calling method into the new class. So this public method here. So I'm going to take that method, and again, initially I'm going to copy it. So I'm going to copy it into the new class. I'm going to put it up at the top because I am going to turn this back into a private method soon, and I like to have public methods at the top and private methods at the bottom because the public ones are the ones that people should be most interested when they come in here. So now I've copied that, nobody's calling it, and the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to find the places in here where it's being called, and I'm going to, well, there's a couple of things actually, because the first thing is that now in this original method, it was creating an instance of this class, which it is now in. So there's no need for that anymore. So I can remove that. I don't like it when it goes red. I don't like it when it's not compiling. I want to get back to a point at which the code is compiling as quickly as possible. But there you go. That only took a couple of seconds. That's now compiling again. But this method, nobody's actually calling it. So you can see it's grayed out. So back in the original class where the copy of it still exists, I'm going to find the places that are calling that function. So I can use Alt F7. Which is the shortcut, and I can see that it's being called in the test, and it's also being called just one place in here. So there's the call. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to make myself a file loader, and my file load, I'm going to call the file loaders version of that function. And I'm also going to do the same in the tests. So in the tests, I'm just going to, the tests are slightly more complex. In fact, no, I'm just going to do this one thing at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make this class call the new version of the function, which means that I can also delete the old version. And again, make sure that my tests are still green, which they won't be because I've just deleted. There you go, I've got a failing test here. Or at least it's not building actually. That's what that means. It's gone kind of brown, which means it's not building. I'm not going to delete the old version. That's not going to work. So on this commit, all I've done is create a copy over in the new class, call the copy from the old code. I'm going to commit that change. I'd already written a commit message before, and now I'm going to edit the test code. So I'm going to find the calls to that function in here. And the way that it's set up in the tests is that I've created a reconciliation intro object, so an instance of the old class, and then I've called the function on that. So what I actually need to do is edit this setup function in my tests so that instead of returning a reconciliation object, I'm going to return a file loader object. And at the moment, my file loader class doesn't have anything injected into it, so I can actually make this a lot simpler. But again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a copy of this method, because otherwise things are going to get a little bit messy while I'm trying to fix it. So I've created a copy, and my copy is going to return a file loader object instead of a reconciliation intro object. So down here, instead of creating a new reconciliation intro, God, that's hard to say, I'm going to create a new file loader object. And now, and this thing here is not happy because it doesn't like the fact that there's two methods that have such similar. I thought the fact that it was returning a different thing would mean that it would let me do it, but it doesn't like it. So I'm just going to call this number 2 temporarily. And now, where it was originally being called, so there, I'm now going to say this isn't going to be a reconciliation object anymore. It's going to be a file loader object. It's going to call number 2, and down here, instead of using the reconciliation intro object, it's going to use the file loader object. I'm going to check and see if there are any more calls to that setup function in here. That's where it's defined. That's the second version. That's the call. There are no other calls in here. So now what I can do is get rid of the old one and rename the new one. ReSharper will do some rename factoring for me, so I get rid of that number 2. So now the tests are also using the new function, which should mean that the old one that I had left behind in the original class is not being called anymore. The fact that it has a green dot here suggests otherwise. Let me check. Yes, so it is being called because when I created those tests, I created a copy of those tests. So it's still being called in the original tests. So now this test is no longer needed because it's calling the old version that I'm about to delete. So I will delete that test. I'm actually going to put this in yet another separate commit because everything's green, I'm happy, and I'm doing things in really small steps. So change utest to call new class. And now I'm going to get rid of that test that I was just looking at that still calls the old version. because that is a duplicate test, so I'm happy that I can delete it. I'm also going to check, it looks like there was one other reference. Oh, that's interesting. No, that's an old reference, that's already been changed. So now my tests are passing. I've moved the function over to the new class. I've changed the tests so that they test the new class and not the old class. So now this really is file loader tests, and everything is still happy. So I'm going to move back to my diagram. I think probably we're about to be out of time anyway, but I'm just going to quickly move back to the article that's got the diagrams in it. There you go. So what I did there was I took this function that was a private function, and I took the function that called it, that was a public function, and I moved both of those into the new file loader. So this is describing here what I did. So this was the private function that I made public. So you can see it was, here's the original private function that was being called by this public function. I then created the new copy, which was public. I got the old code to point to the new function. Then I created a copy of the old code in the new class, and then I changed it so that the old code was calling the new copy, and I could delete the old copy. And the next thing that I'm going to do is start moving more functions over to the new file loader class. And what I've done here is I've drawn a diagram of how these are all being called. So this tree structure lets me see what's at the bottom of the tree. So the things that are at the bottom of the tree are the things that I will move first, so that they have fewer things that are calling them. And then I can gradually move up the tree, moving these functions one at a time into my new class. I'm just going to check time. So we said that we would, oh good, we've got another 10 minutes. Fantastic. Okay, so I can do a bit more then. So the next thing to do could be to move that new function, but I wonder if maybe I want to skip forward a bit. Yeah, so we can look at this thing about member variables. So there are these 4 methods, these load methods: load bank and bank in, load bank and bank out, load credit card, load credit card. And they are all going to get moved to the new class. And they are, they use the input output object that gets injected. So I'm not going to be able to move those functions without also injecting something new into my class. So actually, let's just pick up where we left off. So the next function that I want to move is this load bank and bank out. So if we go back, so what you can see from this diagram, these are the 2 functions that I've already moved. This one, this merge one, is currently being called by this function called load bank and bank out. So let's have a look at that. And I realized that I didn't actually get around to deleting the original function. I just deleted the test. So let's delete that function. I can tell by the black dots that it's not actually got any code coverage anyway. But I am just going to wait for it to go green, get a commit message ready, move unused method. There you go, it's all gone green, the relevant bits. So I'm pretty confident that I can commit that. What I really should do is switch my ncrunch configuration to be optimized differently. But I'm not, I don't know, maybe I should do that now. It's funny, when you know that people are watching you, you feel like, oh no, if I start trying to change configuration stuff, I'm just going to get lost in a bunch of configuration and it's just going to distract everybody. But it would be good to have these tests optimized. Oh, look, I can search up here. optimize. I don't think that's the setting I wanted. It's in here somewhere. Reconciliate. Shared settings. No, I was right. This wasn't a good idea. Never mind. I'm not going to distract by doing that. So back in my main original class, the one that I'm gradually shrinking, I'm going to find the place where this function is being called, which is up here in this function called load bank and bank out. And this function is using the oh, hang on, people are buzzing me. I just need to check what that's all about. Buzz, 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 buzz. Oh, you can't see my ID. Thank you. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Right. The problem is it's Friday afternoon and there's tons of Slack messages going on. So there's a part of my brain that's just going, no, don't pay attention to those annoying little beeps. They're nothing to do with you. In this case, they are something to do with me. There we go. Refactoring. So now, hopefully, you can see the code. Thank you for letting me know. Scott sent me a little Slack icon of a little bee. Right, thanks for that. So this here, buried in here in this horrible code, and I know it's horrible, but I mustn't get distracted because I'm only doing one thing at a time, is this method being called here. And I believe that I can, with only a little bit of change, I'm going to be able to move this whole function over into my new class. But first of all, before I do that, I'm going to need to inject this input-output object. So this input-output object is injected in here so that I can keep my user interaction separate from my logic. And I'm going to just inject that same object into my new file loader class. So actually I can do the clever thing. If I do create a constructor and then say that my constructor is going to take one of these, then ReSharper will do that neat thing for me where it lets me introduce a read-only field. That's the one that I want. So there you go. Now I've got input output being injected into this class. And one other thing that I'm going to do, this is really important, because at the moment, if I left it like that, suddenly I've just broken a whole load of code. It's not going to be building. You'll see down here, my ncrunch thing has gone brown, which means that there are some build errors. Because now every time I've created an instance of this class, it's now saying, well, that's not going to work because you haven't passed in this thing you're supposed to have passed in. But I'm not even using it yet. So I'm going to give it a default value of null. And now all of the calling code will stop breaking again because there's this default value in here. So that's a really useful tip when you're adding parameters to code. Don't just add the parameters and then go chasing your tail all over the place, fixing all the calls to pass the parameter in. First thing you do is give it a default value so that your code compiles, because you want your code to keep compiling at all times. So now I've passed that in. So now that means that I can also, again, take a copy of the function that was calling my function. So this load bank and bank out, horrible thing. I know it's horrible, but I'm just allowing myself to put up with that for now. Taking a copy, putting it into my file loader class, up at the top, up here. And now what's happening in here is this thing is creating an instance of the file loader class, which is legal, it's valid, but I'm creating an instance of myself. There's really no need because I'm now calling a function that is in the same class as me. Need to import some stuff. So I'm going to fix that because I can just get rid of that file loader instance. Don't need that anymore. So now it's just calling a method that belongs to the same file. And back over here, what I can do is actually, I'm just going to put that back in again because I can copy it. That'll be useful. Or cut it instead of delete it. There we go. And now when that is being called, so what I'm doing, this is sorry, I keep doing this and not explaining it, but this is something I do a lot, which is that I do Control F3. There are similar shortcuts on a Mac that means that I can search for that name. So now in here I just do F3 and that means I can find the same bit of text. So this is where that function is called. It's only called in one place. So I found the definition and I found the call. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file loader here and I'm going to call the object on the file loader. But this time, even though I don't have to because I created a default, I am going to pass in my input output object because why not? And I am going to need it. So that's being passed in. And I've got a build error down here. What's that? What have I done wrong? Let's have a look. That might be, there we go. So that wasn't the only thing that I needed to inject. So I also need to inject a spreadsheet factory, which wasn't injected in here, but will need to be injected in the new class, because in here it was newed up there. I'm not going to try and explain what that's doing. But now I'm going to pass that in here. I generally, you might have noticed already, prefer vertical lists of parameters so that you can read them all and you don't have to go scrolling all the way over to the right. It's shouting at me because you can't have a default value for a parameter that is before a parameter that doesn't have a default value. The default values all have to go at the end of the parameter list, but I'm going to do the same thing with a new one anyway, and I'm going to use lovely resharper to introduce a read-only field. So now that is also being objected. I don't want the underscore there or there. Hang on, I do want it there, but I don't want it there. There we go. The underscore, for those that don't know, is used to indicate that it's a member variable. So now the final thing I can do is inject that. Again, I don't have to because I did give it a default value, but I may as well. I'm going to need it anyway. So let me just find where I was calling that function again in here. And I'm going to inject the spreadsheet factory as well. So now, because I've injected it and I've created a local member variable that stores it, that means that this code is no longer failing to compile. This function is being called, but at the moment it's not being covered by any tests. And the reason for that is I haven't amended my tests to call the new version instead of the old version. So that'll be my next job. But first of all, I'm going to commit this as ever, small commits. And now I have run out of time. So I'm going to stop this Twitch screen. I'm going to stop this Twitch stream. We're going to have a 10-minute break, and then the people who are joining me in this workshop, can we all go back to Zoom? So at 3:30, can we all meet back again in Zoom? Okay, thank you.